Good afternoon. This is David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English podcast. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has presided over the destruction of the Venezuelan economy during his 3 years in power, as the nation has grappled with hyperinflation, declining oil production, political unrest, and shortages of food, medicine, and consumer products. Now it has defaulted on its numerous debts to international creditors. But China and Russia, in an apparent bid to boost their geopolitical power in Latin America, have been letting Maduro off the hook, extending a lifeline to him. Russia has allowed Venezuela to renegotiate its billions in debt. What is happening now is being called the world's most complicated debt restructuring. 15 years ago, the Latin American left was on a meteoric rise, governing the region's largest nations, such as Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela. Venezuela now is diplomatically isolated. It's a pariah state. It really just counts on the support of three hardcore communist regional allies: Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega, Cuba under Raúl Castro, and Bolivia under Evo Morales. In practical terms, their support is rather inconsequential. It's great for moral support, but these are not global powerhouses. Nicaragua, Cuba, and Bolivia are not Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Speaking of Brazil, Venezuela has declared the Brazilian and Canadian ambassadors to be personas non grata, meaning that they have found fault with something that they have done and they are to be expelled from the country. This has much to do with the recent ban on three opposition parties participating in next year's presidential election. The Canadian Foreign Ministry said Canada will not stand by as the government of Venezuela robs its people of their fundamental democratic and human rights and denies them access to basic humanitarian assistance. With regard to Brazil, former Foreign Minister Delcy Rodriguez referenced the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff last year, and it appears that Brazil has also raised concerns about the ban on these political parties on the part of the Maduro regime. At this point, what is going on with Russia, China, and Venezuela? This essentially is a high-stakes geopolitical game. And Maduro has a very different outlook than a democratically elected leader in a representative constitutional democracy or a parliamentary democracy. The only thing that Maduro and his close allies like Diosdado Cabello, Delcy Rodriguez, Tarek El Aissami, the only thing that they care about at this point is clinging on to power. So to that end, Maduro is going to make any deal that gives him money and power now at the expense of the Venezuelan people and government down the road. We've already seen this with some of the reckless financial deals he's put together, including a deal with Goldman Sachs that was widely criticized in the media. We are talking now about a nation where inflation was estimated at 57% in November. 50% monthly inflation is generally considered the benchmark for hyperinflation. It is really hard to describe what is happening in Venezuela unless you see it. I mean, we are talking about serious shortages of food and medicine that is leading to hundreds of deaths, a breakdown of public services, a breakdown of law and order. It is a desperate failed state. I mean, it's heading down the same road of something like Somalia, where really there is no law and order, there is no rule of law, and the only people who can survive are the people who are loyal to the Maduro government. And so the biggest development recently with Russia has basically let Venezuela off the hook on a $3.1 billion debt payment. Although a recent study by the Harvard Law Roundtable estimates that Venezuela actually owes around $9 billion to Russia. So the terms of the debt were very favorable. I mean, this is the term letting someone off the hook could not be more applicable here. The $3.15 billion debt payment has now been restructured over 10 years with minimal payments due in the first 6. It is apparently only Russia and China themselves know the actual terms of the deal, but this is a big lifeline for the Venezuelan regime as they desperately attempt to cling on to power. And China has repeatedly gone to bat for Maduro in a rather laughable statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry last month. They said, "We believe the Venezuelan government and people have the ability to appropriately handle their affairs, including the debt issue." With all due respect to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, this is nothing short of laughable. What this is nothing but one hardcore communist dictatorship going to bat for another hardcore communist dictatorship. And when you're the world's second biggest economy and closing in on overtaking the United States as the world's biggest economy, this is still a relatively minor concern. China has been known to take long-term, high-stakes gambles in countries which have key natural resources. And Venezuela, with the world's largest oil reserves, clearly fits the bill there. What is particularly curious here is that Maduro and Chavez had always in the past been very punctual, been very responsible with making payments to creditors, to international creditors. Presumably to try to secure financing in the future, to try to assure their geopolitical allies and their debtors that everything is in order. Default was inevitable, and Venezuela has, as of November of 2017, defaulted. There is no sugarcoating this. They owe over $60 billion to bondholders, and their total estimated debt has been placed at just under $200 billion. And they've been slowly draining their foreign currency reserves. They're now estimated to be around $9 billion. So Venezuela is hemorrhaging money. Much of their oil output is already spoken for to China, because China has made these deals where basically they loan cash in exchange for claims on future Venezuelan oil production. So this is a complete and total disaster. Complete and total disaster. Making things even worse, the Russian petroleum exporter Rosneft has taken nearly a 50% stake in the American arm of the Venezuelan state oil company, PDVSA. Now that is Citgo. Citgo is a very large company here, and in exchange for a $1.5 billion loan to Maduro, Rosneft now owns nearly half of Citgo. There have been reports that Maduro is now trying to buy back Rosneft's stake in Citgo in exchange for some claims to oil fields. So Russia and China here are helping to prop up the Maduro regime, and it's very likely that without the support of Russia and China, Maduro would not be in power today. It's certainly not Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua, tiny, virtually inconsequential economies that are propping him up. It is Russia and China. He's alienated the entire Latin American region. He's alienated pretty much everyone else in the world. Russia and China obviously are not democracies. China is not a democracy in any way, shape, or form. Russia is not a democracy in any real sense of the word. So the Russian and Chinese publics do not know or care that they are subsidizing the Maduro dictatorship. With a nation like China, we are talking about drops in the bucket here. With a nation like Russia, it would be difficult to make a domestic political issue out of this. Even, I mean, with the Russian opposition, the liberal-minded Russian opposition, I'm sure they're not happy about this, but in Russia, where the media is so controlled by Putin and his allies, I don't see Russians taking to the streets to protest that they are actually subsidizing the brutality and irresponsibility of Nicolas Maduro, unfortunately. What is clear here is that Venezuela is now negotiating from a position of weakness, and it really doesn't matter at this point what's going to happen 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 years down the road. Venezuela, under Maduro, is going to cut a deal that only takes into consideration short-term goals. And Venezuela owes an estimated $23 billion to China alone. Chinese banks have loaned $60 billion to Venezuela over the course of the past decade. With regard to Russia, Maduro made an October visit to Moscow to meet with Putin, and he very publicly thanked Putin for all the support, political and diplomatic, in difficult times which we are living through. What is abundantly clear here is what a complete and utter fool Hugo Chavez and the Socialist Party in Venezuela have been. What complete and utter fools they've been. For well over a decade, Venezuela used its oil to buy geopolitical influence around the region and around the world. Venezuela clearly did not have its own house in order, and its national finances were a ticking time bomb, which now has most infortuitously exploded in the lap of Chavez's hapless successor, Nicolas Maduro. The amount of money that is estimated to have gone just to line the pockets of the political class in Caracas is astounding. It's been estimated at $300 billion. Why are Russia and China bailing out Venezuela now? Well, geopolitical influence, of course, to thumb their noses at the United States, which obviously has a stake in this poker game as well. And of course, they're looking down the road to a future Venezuela when Venezuela might be ruled by the opposition or someone who is not Nicolas Maduro, and when oil might return. Now it's trading at around $50 a barrel. Who knows where oil will go in the future? Could it go to $100 a barrel again? Well, most analysts aren't seeing that anytime soon, but it is very hard to predict what is going to happen in the future with commodities prices. They're all dependent upon supply and demand. But the bottom line here is that Venezuela has no way out until they address their hyperinflation, and that's not going to happen with the current regime because they have absolutely no grasp on economic policy or anything else. It's important to remember, too, like other dictatorial regimes like a Libya or a Syria, people are not appointed to their positions for their knowledge, but for their political loyalty. So the people heading up the PDVSA and the various government ministries are not there because they're technical experts in their field. They are there because they'll do whatever Nicolas Maduro tells them to do. And that also is an extremely serious problem. Ultimately, one possible way out here would be some kind of exile for Nicolas Maduro, possibly Cuba, or possibly a place like Russia or China. There's a very interesting article in the Financial Times by John Paul Rathbone and Robin Wigglesworth. And it says here, the government, quote, the government simply wants to survive. It fears that bondholders, which only want to be paid, could seize its exported oil cargoes in the event of a default, cutting off Caracas from its sole source of revenue. Then there are the superpowers. Washington wants to curtail an increasingly rogue regime implicated in global drug trafficking that sits on $15 trillion of oil reserves only a 3-hour flight from the U.S. Moscow, meanwhile, seeks to parlay Caracas's distress into a stronger foothold in the Americas. China's interests are more commercial, having loaned $60 billion to Caracas over the past decade. It wants continued access to Venezuela's vast energy reserves. So, what could happen here in the future, and what is, in my opinion, far more likely to force Maduro from power than a military revolt or a coup, is simply that if Venezuela is not paying up, Venezuela has to export the oil to take in revenues for its government, of course. But, under various provisions of international law, there are circumstances under which its oil could be seized by its international creditors and sold to pay off Venezuela's debts. Now, this would really be the endgame scenario for the Venezuelan regime. If this happens and they have no more income stream, that would probably be game over. And as much as the Venezuelan people would suffer in the meantime, which is obviously a very tragic byproduct of all this, that ultimately may be a very possible scenario for 2018, that Maduro is forced from power as Venezuela is unable to meet its debt obligations. As it stands now, Venezuela has only around $9 billion in foreign currency reserves and $200 billion in outstanding debt. They are not going to be able to make the payments. They have no way to do it. Even if oil prices do recover somewhat, there really is no guarantee that Venezuela can make debt payments. I mean, they may be able to make late payments over the course of the next year or so, but they are in serious trouble. And what we are all hoping for is that one way or another, Maduro and his crooked cronies are forced from power sooner rather than later, and with a minimal loss of life for the Venezuelan people. This has been David Unsworth with the PanAm Post English podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.